So in this video, we're going to look at monetary versus fiscal policy from the viewpoint of the objectives to be achieved through monetary or fiscal policy and who controls it, and how, although they can stimulate aggregate demand in the same kind of way, why in certain instances there's going to be more fiscal policy being used, other instances monetary policy, how they could move together or how they could move in opposite directions. Let's dive in. So to start off, let's understand what fiscal policy is and what monetary policy is. Fiscal policy is a change in government spending or a change in taxation to either stimulate the economy or to contract it. So for the examples here, we're always going to use the stimulation one, the expanding one. So in this case, for fiscal policy, it would be to increase government spending to stimulate the economy or decrease taxes to stimulate the economy. It doesn't have to be both. They don't move together. It could be one or the other. And when it comes to taxation, it could be different forms of taxation in the economy, whether it's income taxes or sales taxes. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is expansionary monetary policy is a drop in interest rates to stimulate spending. So when we talk about monetary policy, I've gone through this in a separate video of how money supply and interest rates are linked. They're inversely related. So it'd be like expanding the money supply leads to a drop in interest rates, or we start with a drop in interest rates, which will stimulate the other factors in the economy. So expansionary for monetary policy, drops in interest rates. Who controls both of these? Well, fiscal policy is controlled by the government in power. So whichever party's in power, they're going to control the budget, and they're going to control their spending and taxes, tax cuts. Whereas monetary policy is controlled by the central bank of that country. So there is a difference between the two. They both can achieve the same objectives. So we've seen we will see in different graphs with aggregate demand, aggregate supply, that whether we're talking about government intervention through fiscal policy or monetary policy, they're both going to change the aggregate demand curve. In the case of an expansion, it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, which is typically used to get out of a recession, to stimulate the economy when we're in a slump kind of phase. But one of them is controlled by the party in charge, and the other one's controlled by the central bank. So now understanding kind of like the advantages and disadvantages of each. Well, obviously when you're doing expansionary fiscal policy, there is a high potential that the government in charge is going to run a bigger budget deficit. So whether it started with a surplus and it's going to end up with a balanced budget, or started with balance, ends up with a deficit, or it has a deficit, ends up with a bigger deficit, it's moving in that direction, because you cannot increase government spending without ending up with potentially a greater deficit if you keep taxes the same, or if you keep government spending the same and you decrease taxes, you typically have less revenue. Therefore, your spending over your revenue is going to be greater, and therefore you're going to have a greater budget deficit. So that's typically the case, that when you want to stimulate the economy, under fiscal policy, it's going to lead to a greater deficit, unless you believe, like the Laffer curve, which we'll see in a separate video, that your country is currently way overtaxed and that it is possible to lower the tax rate and to have more tax revenue, because there's going to be a lot more people working or a lot more people spending, and therefore the revenue will be higher, although the rate is lower. But typically speaking, if we use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy, we accept that we are indebting ourselves more as a country as that government that's in charge. And when we think about fiscal policy, it often, yes, there is going to be stimulation when the economy is not doing so well, but otherwise you could think that the way that fiscal policy is managed is based on the beliefs of the party in charge. So if you have a more left-leaning party in charge, they may promote more spending on clean technologies, on social services and whatnot, which stimulates the economy, yes, because it's more spending, but they'll have typically higher tax rates. Whereas if it's more right-leaning, they'll probably have less services involved, but lower tax rates. So both of them kind of end up having the same kind of impact on the economy in terms of stimulation and whatnot, or contracting of the economy. But when it comes to the central bank, their main mandate is to keep price stability. So what we mean by price stability is inflation rate low and stable. And many countries, that target is 2% inflation yearly with this 1 to 3% range. That is their first goal. The secondary goal that they have typically is to have employment as close as possible to potential output, which on the graph that we see in macroeconomics is that long-run aggregate supply curve that represents potential output. We want to have our actual output as closely as possible to that we're not underproducing. If both of these goals mean that they can do one policy adjustment and both lead to the same kind of impact, positive impact, then it's easy for them to do something about it. It's harder though, as we've seen in another video, when we have stagflation, because in that case, if they stimulate the economy, they create more inflation problem, but it solves the output problem. But if they contract the economy to solve the inflation problem, well, they make the output problem greater. But if we have a negative demand shock where we have like downward pressure on prices, downward pressure on production, and they decide to lower interest rates to increase price level and increase production, well, then that works. But that's their mandate. And their goal does not fit with the government in charge all the time. So you might have some friction between the two where the government that's in charge wants the central bank to cut rates and tries to put pressure on them to cut rates. And it's very important that the central bank remains separate, because otherwise it's hard to trust that they're always going to focus on that main mandate, because they might be swayed by political influence. And although some people want to put pressure, it's a very bad thing for the central bank to have political influence, because that's what happened in all the years of hyperinflation, of massive price increases in many countries, is when there wasn't that independence between the two. Because if there was that independence, well, if there was an inflation problem, the central bank would have done everything in its power to reduce that inflation problem, even if it led to large unemployment periods where the economy and the people in that country suffer, which means that that party in charge may not get reelected. But that's what you got to do to solve that inflation problem. So we have to understand that difference in viewpoint possibly. So that's why, although both of them are shifting the aggregate demand curve, they do it in slightly different ways. And so if the government in charge wants to decrease taxes, well, that's going to stimulate the economy. If it stimulates it too much based on potential output, it's possible that the central bank's going to have to slow down the economy, which will kind of go against the other one's policy. So they typically move in the same direction when we're in a recession, because in a recession, you'll have the government cutting out stimulus checks, dropping taxes, spending more. And at the same time, you're going to have the central bank lowering interest rates. And all of that's going to lead to a positive aggregate demand shock. And it's going to lead to getting back to potential output quicker. But if we start from a situation where the economy is already well functioning, we're at low unemployment rates, and the government just wants to stimulate the economy even more, well, in that situation, you might have the government in charge dropping tax rates, which leads to the aggregate demand to shift, which would put us in a boom situation, an inflationary situation. And then you'll have the central bank move the aggregate demand curve back in the opposite direction by increasing by increasing interest rates. Then you would have the central bank move in the opposite direction, the aggregate demand curve, by increasing interest rates. So we have to understand who controls what and what their goal is. So The goal behind the politicians that control fiscal policy is to make the economy as good as possible, to get reelected, to advance their agenda. So if their goal is lower tax rates, well, they move in that direction. If their goal is more environmental provisions that lead to a cleaner environment, better healthcare and whatnot, that's the direction that they may move in. If we're going through recession, they'll potentially have different ways of solving it. But at the end of the day, they want to get reelected, so they want to advance their agenda and advance the reasons why they got elected. The central bank, though, is free from political influence as much as possible, and their goal, whether it's a left-leaning or a right-leaning political party that's in charge, does not change. And that goal is price stability and staying as closely as possible to potential output. And because of that, they're free from that influence, and they're just going to fixate on that goal. They don't care whether we're going through high unemployment and high inflation. They'll have to fix one of the two, but they don't care if an election cycle is coming through, whether this person looks good or looks bad because the economy is not doing as good as they would hope. They're not going to favor someone's image. They're just going to focus on price stability and getting close to potential output. So hopefully you understand who makes the decisions for both of these, fiscal and monetary policy, in this video. And I'll catch you in a separate video going into more depth on how fiscal policy works and on how monetary policy works. Have a good day. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real-life examples. Have a good day.